Welcome everybody to 5D University, and today's video is going to be about spiritual ego and superego. So when we went through the programmings of the ego, the last two programmings are superego and spiritual ego. So, and these are kind of their own category of programmings because the rest of the programmings are kind of very obvious. Maybe sometimes they're subtle, but a lot of times they're pretty easy to pick up and to identify in terms of the frequency of them. But superego and spiritual ego can be very kind of manipulative in that it can appear to be divine, or it can appear to be someone who is, speaking the pure whole truth, and it's not. And so it's a very sophisticated style of ego, so which is why they kind of deserve their own video explaining them, because it's something we should all be aware of in terms of just self-reflection of, if we're falling into those traps, as well as being able to identify them within somebody else. So the superego is kind of exactly what it would sound like. It's when someone is so deep in the mind and in the ego programming that it kind of becomes hyper inflated. Now, I think on a surface level, most people would be able to identify people who have superego because it can present in a very obvious way. So this would be someone who's so deeply in the mind, so deeply in the ego, that they tend to fall into one of two categories. One is very outward, very obvious. So this would be people who we identify as kind of being on the sociopathic scale, not having empathy and compassion and connection to humanness. They're very arrogant. They think that they know it all. They think that they're better than everybody. They think that they have it all figured out. So that's one very obvious example of the superego. And a lot of people wonder, I think the best example that came to me as I was thinking about was Harvey Weinstein. I don't know why he just came to my brain as a really good example because, he obviously had a long history of acting in a very lower way and very misaligned way. And it went on kind of for so long, and he wasn't held accountable, and people were in fear of him, that he developed this really deep superego, which a lot of the beings who spoke out about him, kind of shared a similar sentiment in that he saw himself in a very different way than what everybody else saw him as. And that's an indication of the superego. When you feel that you see yourself in this way of you're this grandiose, amazing, successful person, and everybody else is like, this behavior is really toxic, this behavior is really harmful, and they can't see it, and there's no connection being made. That's an easy to spot sign of the superego, because the superego can't see itself. So the ego in general is lack of awareness. It's a lack of awareness that develops programmings. The superego is almost this hyperinflated version of the ego, to which the being who's embodying it literally cannot see themselves at all. They cannot see themselves from the outside in. They have it all in their mind of who they are and what they do, and it's completely different than what everybody else sees. And so you're kind of also, you can see that within just the way that everything is unfolding globally. I think you'll see a lot of times where prominent people or people who are speaking in the media or in the government, etc., they have a very hard time of self-reflection. They are just unable to see what vibration they are giving off and how they're actually presenting versus what they think in their minds they are presenting. Now, the other subtler version of the superego is more of an internal superego. And this is kind of where I would say we get a lot more of the truther community superego. So the external superego, again, is going to be quite obvious. It can borderline on just, someone who's extremely toxic, very much in the lower, really devoid of human feeling and connection. And so they really can't see themselves, and they're so out of tune with the heart space. And the more subtle version, the more internal version, is someone who is caught up in thought loops. So if you have racing thoughts, and there's a lot of people who may not even realize that they are actually embodying levels of superego, because they may not outwardly be expressing these things, but they are thinking them internally. And so it can result in kind of this deep thought loop, this deep mental rabbit hole that kind of never ends. And so if you have that where it's racing all the time and you can't break out of it, that is superego. And again, superego lives in the consciousness. So sometimes if someone's a particularly open vessel, they may attract that superego energy, which is basically, in the more subtle internal version, it's this deep rabbit hole of constant analyzation of things, constant thought loops, just this chatter in the mind that just won't stop. And so it kind of happens sometimes in the truther communities, as I see, because there's a lot of beings who have woken up and are awakening, and they're learning a lot of information, and that's great. But they end up going down this really deep internal rabbit hole where they start to analyze everything to such an extent that it becomes superego, that they're not present in the moment of now anymore. They're completely in the mind, analyzing and going through thoughts and just trying to deep dive down every rabbit hole possible. And that brings you completely outside of the present moment. So superego operates in many different ways, but those are the two kind of telltale signs. One is a constant mind loop, a constant almost obsession with thinking about things and analyzing them. And the other is a very external, more obvious representation, which is someone who's completely separated from the heart and is completely in the mind, to the point where they have exaggerated themselves to such a level that they are now just delusional. They're no longer, living in the present moment of now. So both are extreme versions of being outside of the present moment, right? And again, this can come in many different forms. There's so many more examples. I feel that there's a lot of beings who are in academia and in the intellectual community who are in superego, because they are so deep into, again, the intellectualization of the world and of life, that they are removed from the feeling and they are removed from the heart. They are just completely living up here. So anyone that is basically completely living up here and is not anchored into the heart, which is the present moment, it will develop into superego. And most of humanity has been in superego for probably a lot of their incarnations, because we, again, have been programmed and taught to be outside of the heart and to be operating up here in the intellectual mental space, or to be fully in the lower chakras, which is where we get kind of this obsession with materialism and attachment to people, places, and things, fight or flight, survival, all of these type of things. So the heart center is really where we want to be at, and the superego is going to take us all the way up here into the mind. Again, it can kind of also take us all the way down to be just in the lower chakras as well. That might be presenting as constant fear and worry and anxiety and fight or flight that we can't get out of. That can also be kind of a symptom of the superego, but again, it all originates in the mind. And so getting into the heart and really learning to be in the present moment of now is very important, because again, This is collective. So until this energy is completely transformed by the collective, we are all going to experience it on micro levels at different times in order to transform it. So whenever we kind of have that feeling that we are way too much in the mind, or we're really deep in fight or flight, we want to bring ourselves back to the heart and to the present moment. And that's where the tools and techniques and the disciplines come in, because those are key for us. So the other major programming is spiritual ego, and this is a whole nother animal. So the biggest manifestation of the spiritual ego is belief system. So I would say that the superego's core problem is attachment to information and attachment to thoughts, right? As in the examples, we see that someone who's really attaching to their own thoughts and believes everything they think to be true develops this kind of deep disconnect between what they're actually presenting as and versus what they think they are presenting as, because they're so attached to their own thoughts that they aren't able to see past that. Attachment to information also creates superego, because you're trying to figure it all out and you're never going to, especially from the mind. So attachment to information and attachment to thoughts is the core thing of the superego. Now, the core thing of the spiritual ego is belief systems. So a lot of people who end up getting onto the spiritual path, which is just simply the path of love. Everybody is spiritual. There are many people who they develop, they develop a certain area of expertise, so to speak, from their experiences. So you have channelers, you have healers, you have kind of people that have been gurus or whatever you want to call it. Everybody kind of had their area of like skills and expertise within the spiritual community. But what happened was, especially starting back, the light worker community has been building for quite a while. We had the 60s and 70s with the free love movement, but really after the harmonic convergence of 1987 is when we saw a big burst and boom in terms of the spiritual community and light workers. And that it was very new back then, but that's when it really started to form. And what kind of happened was that the spiritual community did not come together in unity. They all wanted to do their own separate things. And I think, as we've seen, a lot of them feel that they are the ones who know everything and they have the answers, but there was no unification within this community. And so what has happened is now within the spiritual community, you have so many split and fractured collectives, because there are certain spiritual people who align with this certain belief system within the spiritual community. And then there are others who really align with this other belief system. And so you still have this fracturedness within the spiritual community. And again, spirituality, everyone is spiritual. The spiritual journey, the spiritual communities is all the same. It's reuniting with source, getting into balanced harmonics within yourself, which is masculine, feminine balance, dissolving the ego and embodying the God self. That's it. And being in service to others. That is, as we talked about in the Ascension Journey video. So the spiritual ego is basically someone who develops kind of a level of spiritual awareness. But unfortunately, what then happens is that new belief systems form. Even though the whole idea of exiting the mind and exiting the matrix and exiting 3D is to exit belief systems, because belief systems are what keeps us trapped. Belief systems are what keeps us recreating old realities and past things into the present moment. So the fact that we now have so much spiritual belief systems has caused a great rift, I feel, in the ascension process, because this could have been more seamless. We could have unified more into kind of one message, which is this is the path of love. Very simple. We are returning to love. We are returning to source. Again, very simple. We are aligning with Mother Earth, Gaia, the divine feminine energies, which this planet is a feminine essence. So we have to align more with the feminine principles of oneness and compassion and all of these things. And it all is actually very simple. But the spiritual ego is very crafty. And so one of the main things that you'll be able to pick out about spiritual ego, and we've all gone through it as well. So, I mean, I can speak from my own personal experience on it too, is you kind of start to feel like you've figured it all out. And then you start to create these kind of rigid ways of like, this is the way it has to be done. This is, the only path. And of course, there's many paths. And I think what it comes down to is spiritual ego is going to make things sound complicated. This is pretty much the easiest way to discern. The spiritual ego is going to make things complicated because it's still in the mind. And the mind seeks complication because it tries to continuously solve problems. That's all it knows how to do, is analyze and solve problems. So if there's no problems, it has nothing to do. And so it starts going crazy. So we keep kind of creating more problems that we need to solve and more things that we need to uncover and learn. And then before you know it, we're complicating everything to the point that we're making it seem like the average person, the average human being cannot attain that level, right? That they have to go through all this training and years of this and that to attain this spiritual level. And that's just simply not true. Everything is simple. Love is simple. God is simple. Source is simple. So again, it's the path of love. So you will find that if you are confused, and there's a lot of misinformation out there, and so the truth is that we don't have to be afraid of misinformation. We simply have to develop our own discernment levels, right? Because for someone, they may think it's the truth, right? And really it's misinformation. And until we all rise to the level of having that divine discernment, we're going to go through these phases where there's going to be things that we start to have to sift out that really aren't true, or they're not true for us now. They're not in resonance with where we're at now, etc. So as we move through, eventually everyone's discernment levels are going to rise and we will come into that one truth. Right now, we're still sifting through all the layers of what isn't true based on how we feel and how we resonate with it. And ultimately, we will all get to the one truth. But the spiritual ego will try to make things very complicated, seem very complex, or, try to kind of put out this idea that you have to be this high level person, in order to be God with God. You have to reach this high level. I mean, I'll just give you like really easy examples. Like I've seen spiritual people out there who, they dress in this certain way that kind of is the ego's way of what we think divinity is, which is very similar to what we see within the religious institutions. They'll dress in all white, kind of, they think they have to look godly or something. There's like these belief systems about, what a spiritual person is, what a godly person is. And so they still have all these belief systems. So they kind of try to fit the part, the way they speak. I'll notice that a lot of like spiritual people, they just can't say things plainly and like humanly and simple that you would explain to a friend or a family member. They want to make it sound like it's this very high level, like very intricate thing, and or they maybe speak from this place of like, use these fancy words, and it's like, no, it's all just very, very simple. And the more simple we make it, the easier it's going to be for everybody. So that's just kind of the two really inflated programmings that tend to pop up the most. So again, spiritual belief systems, and superego attachment to informations and thoughts. Another example would kind of be like the vegetarian and vegan movement. So I was vegetarian for 8 years, so I very much understand why people get into it, and there are a lot of benefits to it. And then I also understand the belief systems behind it now that I'm no longer a vegetarian. But that was kind of a big spiritual ego belief system that got really pushed onto everybody. A lot of people did it, because we care about animals and because we wanted to be healthier, etc. But there was also this like big push of like, oh, you're not spiritual if you eat meat, and you're not spiritual if you, drink soda. And we have to understand that this is how the mind works. It seeks to create limits, and it seeks to create a box in which to put something in so that it makes sense to the mind. But nothing about the ascension process is going to make sense to the mind. It can only make sense to the heart. So whenever we're discerning information, and whenever we are opening ourselves, up to learning more and exploring the different paths and the different tools and techniques and the different information, we just have to keep following what resonates with your heart. Now, what I also will say is it's a big discernment test for everybody, because I will say this: the reason that superego and spiritual ego developed was because the ego itself is very resistant to truth. So we have to understand that. The mind is very resistant to whole truth, because whole truth heals. And if we are healed, the mind cannot exist. The mind can only exist, and when I say the mind, I'm not talking about the brain. I'm not talking about divine thoughts, inspirations, innovations, those sort of things, communication. Talking about the ego programmings, which run as like a virus that create the mind. So the mind cannot exist in a healed state. So when it is presented with truth, it will normally reject it off the bat, especially if it's a very large truth that kind of collapses their, constructs and beliefs. So the superego developed, which is basically a way of someone hiding the real truth and kind of giving you these little half truths and mistruths. And that way it's more palatable for the minds, right? And so superego kind of developed off of this attachment to information, knowing that humans in the mind have this attachment to information. The superego is very clever in the way that it tries to present truth, but it gives you mistruth, half-truth, or just flat out lies and delusions, right? To make it more palatable. Because someone in the superego is like trying to make sense of everything because their mind is so uncomfortable by the fact that something doesn't make sense. Or they're trying to put on a persona to such an exaggerated state that is so wildly different from actually what's going on internally, that it also creates this confusion. So superego tends to create confusion and a lot of attachment. Spiritual ego, right? Spiritual ego developed again for the same reason, because ego has a hard time with truth. So the spiritual community was, they did take a lot of hits in terms of have been sharing a lot of truth again since the harmonic convergence that was very much rejected and ostracized, conspiracy theorists, crazy people, etc. So they kind of had to develop this spiritual ego as a way to reach the masses and find this way to make it mainstream, right? And so we see how now all of these problems have compounded. So in terms of discernment levels, what you have to understand these two things at play when you're learning new information, or you're trying to figure out, what is the truth, what resonates with me, is you have to gauge your responses and reactions to information. So if you read a piece of information or hear a piece of information and it really triggers you on a deep level and your immediate reaction is to want to reject it, argue with it, say that's not true, take a second and really feel into why it's triggering you. What belief system is it triggering? And how can you integrate this information and say, okay, it's obviously triggering something within me. It's obviously triggering a belief system. Let me look at my belief system and kind of break that down and then see how that information resonates with me. Because people just want to be told the truth, but they want it in this little ways that make it palatable for the mind. And that's not whole truth. It's just not. So everybody wants this truth, but when people are speaking the truth, the mind glitches out. And it wants something a little softer, and it wants something not as harsh and not as dramatic, and they want it to be said in this very specific way, and they want the messenger of that truth to look a certain way and to present a certain way. The ego wants everything to fit into their boxes to make them more comfortable. So a good rule of thumb is that if a piece of information, whether that be a spiritual information, disclosure information, anything, gauge your reaction to it. The likelihood is that if something really triggers you, there's something within you, that there's actually a piece of truth there that your ego does not like. If you hear a piece of information and it is like, it makes you kind of be like, oh yeah, I can accept that. Still look at it with a discerning eye of like, well, is this full whole truth, or does my ego kind of just like this because it's making me feel better? And it's, of course, positivity and uplifting messages are never to be, never to be rejected, where we're all here to build each other up and share love, etc. So it's not like the truth always has to be just catastrophic to someone, but I just mean learning our discernment levels, again, of being able to spot spiritual ego and super ego, and gauging what information is presented to us and how it triggers us. Because the truth is going to trigger us. The truth is always going to trigger us because we've been living through eons of time in half-truths, mistruths, or just flat-out lies. So it's not always that we have to reject the information or what is being said, is that we have to dive deeper into what it is triggering within us. And then we'll start to notice how we see the spiritual ego and the super ego play into the misinformation or half-truths, right? So that is just kind of a brief explanation of how these things present, and good for us all to be aware of in terms of discernment levels. So when you come across something or any path you're looking to take, any direction with information and new knowledge, again, always feel into the heart space, how it resonates with your heart. And especially if there's a trigger there, really feel into it of why it's triggering. Deconstruct the belief system within that, and then see how it resonates with you. Because when we're in a very reactive state because something's been triggered, we tend to reject truth off the bat, and we tend to want it to be, again, given to us on this kind of nice little silver platter, and it sounds really great, and because that's the way the mind is, it wants everything to just be easy and in a box and very palatable, and it doesn't like anything that breaks down its boxes. So those are just kind of tidbits in terms of us navigating the rest of the unfoldment of disclosure and things that are happening. Stay in the heart. Present moment of now is the safest place to be. In the present moment, you can feel, you can discern, you can transform, and you can just stay in that guided space where you're not attaching to anything. You're also not reacting constantly to external things, but you're in a place of neutrality and centeredness, and you can discern your way through the rest of the journey so that everybody can kind of discern what feels right for them, what resonates with them, which path is highest and best for them. So thank you guys. Feel free to share if this resonates. Again, please check out our website at 5dfulldisclosure.org and the library tab if you're looking for more resources to look through. We do have a whole guide on superego that explains it more in depth, as well as many other guides that you may utilize for your journey. And if anyone's looking for one-on-one help or guidance, please book a session with us, and we'll be back soon.